Hi, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Explicitly Pro-Life podcast. I'm Kristen Hawkins. Thanks for tuning in this week, and thanks for subscribing. Now, as you all know, we have entered into our official second season, and this year, well, actually, this season's not going to go a whole year, but this season, we're going to just talk about Pro-Life 101, kind of an introduction to the pro-life movement, an introduction to the issues, but this isn't just something that's just for folks who are new to the pro-life movement. You're going to be learning a lot of things that even if you've been in the pro-life movement for decades that you didn't know before, or maybe a better way of talking about an issue. So today I actually have on a scientist. I have Dr. Katrina Furth. She's a neuroscientist. She received her degree from Boston University. She's an adjunct teaching professional at Catholic University, and she's also an associate scholar with the Charlotte Lozier Institute, the research arm of the Susan B. Anthony List, our good friends at the SVA List. So Katrina's spoken at the National Pro-Life Summit. I've seen her around. Actually, we've never met in person before, and we still kind of haven't. We're on Skype today. But Katrina, thanks for coming on to kind of help us with this episode of Pro-Life 101 of how human beings develop and how they become persons. Because I think, we need a scientific response to this question that it often gets asked a lot on college campuses, or I know when I'm speaking, even if I sometimes make a scientific argument, why a human being is a human being from the moment of conception, why I believe that human being has rights, personhood rights, I often will hear the rebuttal of, well, you're not really a scientist, or where did you get your medical degree? So therefore, apparently I'm not supposed to understand like basic biology. But so I wanted to have you on to talk about some of these questions that I hear, that I know pro-lifers, whether they're student or, adult activists in the community will get a lot. Can you go over, I guess for us, just the beginning, basic, the human development, how the human being develops in the womb?
Yes, thank you for having me, Kristen. Yeah. I'm happy to talk about that. So basically, we get a lot of questions. I've seen a lot of questions where people ask, where exactly or when exactly does life begin?
That's right.
And I will often poll my college students and ask them, and I get a variety of answers. But it's a little bit tricky because both the sperm and the egg are alive, and each of them contain half the genetic information that you need to create a new person. But a unique human individual gets formed when a man's sperm combines with a woman's egg in the fallopian tube, creating a zygote. Then you've got a unique human individual. Now, skin cells are also alive, but no one worries when we scratch off a skin cell. Do you know why, Kristen?
I don't know, because I don't have any relationship to a skin cell, because it's not a human being.
Well, hopefully you've got lots and lots of skin cells. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble. But your skin cells are not unique human individuals. Zygotes are. So that zygote has a unique pattern of 46 chromosomes. And all the genetic information is stored within the cell's DNA, which is packaged into those chromosomes. So
that's kind of your answer then. So when someone says, well, this, piece of skin I just pulled off my arm was alive, are you telling me that I just committed murder? We're like, no, that piece of skin doesn't have unique DNA sets, right? It's part of your body, right? It's a parts versus wholes type of argument.
Yep, exactly. So your skin cell is just one of 100 trillion cells that you have. Whereas a zygote is a single cell with all the instructions needed to create a different, unique 100 trillion cell adult. So, exactly, a zygote is one complete whole, whereas your skin cell is just a little section of the whole of you.
It's also to the coordination, like you're talking about, like the embryo, the zygote is self-directed, right? And it has a coordinated effort to grow where, different things might be living, but it's not a coordinated effort. Does that take into a like effect of, oh, this is a human being versus this is just something that's alive that's not a human being?
Yes, I think that's definitely a part of it. So the zygote has a innate process where it's going to start copying its DNA and it's going to start dividing. And it should keep dividing and keep dividing and keep dividing. Every 8 to 10 hours, the zygote divides and makes another set of cells. What's also interesting is that in those first 12 days that the zygote is multiplying and multiplying, if you actually get one of those cells breaking off, you end up with an identical twin because the cells are still ready to keep dividing and create another human.
So that's a question we've heard before. I've heard that on campuses. Well, what about twinning? Twinning often happens days after the embryo has been created. So therefore it couldn't really have been alive if the twinning process didn't happen till days after, and then there were two. What's the pro-life response to that?
Well, there's debate back and forth, but it's pretty common in science to know about budding, basically, where one cell or maybe even a group of cells splits off from an entity, and then they both become new entities. And so basically, our best guess is that identical twins are basically doing some sort of budding process where one cell gets sort of separated from the others, and depending on exactly when, it will either share the same amniotic sac, it will be inside with the other twin, or it will be in its own separate sac, but within the mom at the same time. And basically, each of those twins has everything that it needs to mature into an adult. And so each of those twins becomes the unique human individual worthy of protection.
Yeah. And just because maybe there at one point was only one embryo doesn't mean, and then become, then there's suddenly two. It doesn't mean that one embryo was never alive. That embryo was alive. Exactly. And then now there's two that's alive. That, one existed and then two existed. It didn't go from nothing and then, yeah. So right. That's I think they sometimes, I remember the first time I heard that argument, I was like, oh no, like what's the pro-life response? That seems really, and then I thought about it, I was like, wait a minute, well, it's not dead. The embryo isn't, even if, that cell branches off and there's another now human being that is created, unique, code, it doesn't mean that it was not living to begin with.
Exactly.
Okay. Yep. All right. So we've kind of answered, I guess I'm trying to go through these rebuttals in my head that I normally get. We hear a lot with the semantics of it's just a fertilized egg. So this is an interesting one that I get pinged on this a lot on Twitter and Facebook. So I have been kind of vocal with saying, birth control can be abortifacient because, even makers of birth control pills in their packaging on the back, for example, of Plan B, which is just, a 10 times more powerful birth control pill, it actually says on the left side, it says will not harm an existing pregnancy. And on the right side, in teeny tiny font, it says may prohibit the implantation of a fertilized egg. So they're directly contradicting themselves. And so we talk about it in the pro-life movement. This isn't something we lead off on in college campuses, right? Because if someone doesn't understand that killing a 9-month-old child in the womb is wrong, they're really not going to get why the 5-hour or 2-day-old zygote should be protected. But it is something we have to be consistent about of saying, well, wait a minute, isn't that fertilized egg a human being?
Yes. Yeah. And the fertilized egg is a human being. I think what ends up feeling tricky is that the mom doesn't even know that she's pregnant yet. And in fact, in most cases, the mom won't know that she's pregnant until at least 2 weeks after the egg has been fertilized, and probably more like 3 or 4 weeks, depending on how regular her period is and when she was expecting her period and then missed it and then takes the pregnancy test. And so while the mom is pregnant, she might not know it. And so that that can be confusing to some people. What's interesting is by the time the mom finally does check on her pregnancy and say like, oh, I have a positive pregnancy test, that fertilized egg has become an embryo. And usually it's around the time that the heart starts beating, the neural tube is formed, which is going to become the brain and spinal cord. Like the embryo is in a much more complete state. Now, back to your original question, you had asked why the morning after pill is still morally wrong. And it just goes back to the same argument again and again, that we have to protect all members of the human family. And the unborn, even at the point just 5 hours after fertilization, is a member of the human family.
And they use that, I feel like they use that word. Is that term fertilized egg kind of new? Because I didn't hear it until a couple years ago. Then it became, because it was always embryo. Then they started using zygote, which is a scientific term. But then the fertilized egg term, I was like, where did that come from? Yes, an egg becomes fertilized, but when the egg becomes fertilized, it's no longer a part of the mother. It's no longer an egg, right? It's a unique, whole, living human being. It's never existed before, will never exist again. But they use that word, fertilized egg, to make it seem like that fertilized egg is not a new entity and not a new human being, right?
Right. Now, I think the confusion, or they started using this term because the fertilized egg is a unique human individual, but there's actually a few more basically parts of the process, some DNA splitting involved, and then some duplication that happens. So the zygote doesn't actually divide until at least 12 to 30 hours after the sperm has entered the egg. So it's doing some sort of internal processing. That doesn't make it not a unique human individual. It's just completing the process of getting ready to become that first cell that will become the 100 trillion cells of a adult human.
So what about your colleagues who disagree? So they'll say, no, you're totally wrong, Katrina. It's, that fertilized egg, yes, while it might have new genetic DNA code, it's not, like, what's the argument? Because I don't know. I'm a very black and white person. If anybody listens to this podcast, you'll see that. So I'm like, well, no, duh, it has unique code, therefore it's a human. But the other side, those who advocate for abortion, or scientists who advocate, or say that they're okay with abortion, they'll say, no, this is too complex. You're being too simplistic.
I think they, if they say you're being too simplistic, then ask them to pick a time point that they can defend scientifically about when after fertilization, the zygote, embryo, fetus becomes a unique human individual. And they won't have another time point they can pick, because conception really is the event that makes a unique human individual. And they might want to make another argument, but they're going to be relying on an emotional appeal, not a scientific appeal. So, I mean, basically, they want to pick another time point, probably because they are pro-choice and want to defend their answer, but not because they're using science to do it.
And it also becomes, then it becomes a slippery slope too, because I think people who are intelligent will realize, wait a minute, if I pick something and somebody else picks something else, then you have varying degrees of like humanity. And then isn't that scary? Because in cases in history, when we started to decide who was a human person and who wasn't, that leads itself to some scary situations. So when I've asked that question on campuses, I will hear back and I'll say, well, when do you think a human? And they'll say cognitive development. When they're aware of their environment, when they're conscious, they'll say use the word consciousness. what is it about, those things? I mean, what do we know about the human brain development in the womb and the process that brain, goes through, that growth process? Because when is like full consciousness? I mean, I could attest that I think some people on college campuses aren't fully, conscious. Right. I mean, we talk about self-awareness, because that's another one I hear. It's like, well, they have to be self-aware. Or I heard one, it was like, well, they have to be self-aware and they have to have the capacity to basically want to survive. And so a lot of this, it gets into like, well, then newborns, I guess, do newborns have this capacity to say that they want to preserve their life? Like, they can't do that.
Right. Especially if you've ever interacted with a real newborn, they have trouble focusing their eyes even on something that they want to look at. Right. And they are definitely not self-aware. They aren't following circadian rhythms necessarily, and newborns come out legally blind and partially colorblind, so they definitely aren't fully mature at birth. So I think pointing that out to people can help them feel hopefully squeamish that they don't necessarily want to protect full-term newborns. But then also taking them from that point and moving them backwards in time to points when the first premature babies come out. So, for instance, there have been babies saved at 21 weeks and 4 days after conception, which means gestation, which means they've only been in the mom for 19 weeks and 4 days. Wow. So it's amazing. Science is advancing in leaps and bounds. And basically, babies that wouldn't have even been considered to try and save are getting saved now. And so if you just keep moving things backwards in time, you can say, well, how about these babies that are surviving and their parents want them? Well, most people aren't cruel enough to say, no, I don't think we should be protecting the babies that like the parents want. And once you start pushing them hard enough on hey, at 21 weeks and 4 days, that baby can still get aborted in it's more than 20 states in the union, but that baby can also be saved if it's outside the womb and the parents want it. When people realize, wow, okay, wantedness is the only thing keeping this baby alive, basically, like the only difference, that's not a scientific appeal at all. Whether or not you are wanted does not influence your value.
Right. Absolutely right. What about the brain development? What can you tell us about how the human, what are some of the things that you wish when pro-lifers were talking with pro-abortion folks, like that we knew about the human brain development, or some of the key takeaways? You're like, man, your argument would have been so much stronger if you would have just said this. Because I'm always trying to think of like, what's that thing? What we found on campuses this year on with our spring tour was a really effective argument for us was kind of connecting the dots between the beating heart and the abortion. The fact that every abortion that's committed in the United States stops a beating heart. And that was really significant, because I was like, duh, like, I don't know. That's information I thought everybody knew, but they don't. And connecting that, like, the heart is beating. But regardless of whether you call it a zygote, embryo, fetus, thing, blob of tissue, parasite, it has a beating heart, and you are ending. It's only successful. Your abortion is only successful if the beating heart stops. So that was a really big wake-up call for me of some of our language, and especially when we're trying to kind of move into talking about first trimester abortions, because I think that's really, really important as a movement. I think we've won the third and second trimester argument largely. We haven't won in the sense that they're still happening, but vast majority of Americans, even, the politicians now rally to that cause. But yet still, 9% of abortions in the first trimester. We as a movement need to be talking about these first trimester abortions. So I've been trying to think of like, what are those scientific points, those moments in time I can point to show someone who disagrees about abortion, like, no, really, this is a human being that has value.
Well, I think one of the most interesting things we know is that 5 weeks after conception, we can actually see the fetus moving around using the ultrasound. And so that means that there must be functional connections between neurons and muscles in order to be making these movements. And so if you're committing an abortion after 5 weeks post-conception, then you are stopping a organism, a human that can move, that has the neural capacity to move around. We also know that just 6 weeks after conception, the brain activity is measurable in the brain of the unborn. And it probably exists even earlier. We just haven't measured it yet.
Okay.
And so that's actually the case for a lot of things in the pro-life movement. We can see at behaviors, for instance, like whether or not the fetus shows a preference for his left or right hand. We can see that 8 weeks after conception. But the only way we see that is by using ultrasound, because we want to keep those embryos and those fetuses safe. So as we want to learn more, we have to develop new technologies, basically, to try and record when exactly does that brain activity start. We're not 100% sure, but we know that neural tube was there at 3 weeks. And once it's there, there's likely to start functioning right away. So there's definitely gray area in it because we don't know 100%. But as technology advances, hopefully we will someday know, like, oh yes, it's at 4 weeks and in 3 days or something, and we'll be able to figure that out.
What are some other key like milestones for the child's brain development? I remember the one time I think one of the pro-life kind of brochures out there talks about dreams. The children start having REM sleep at I think it's 18 weeks or something like that.
Yep. Yeah, and the fetus has sleep cycles of 45 minutes or so, which is about half of an adult sleep cycle. But we can see them sort of waking up and then going back to sleep. We can see their eye movements using EEG, and we know that when their eyes are moving quickly, they're having these really like vivid dreams.
What does a fetus dream about? So
that's a great question.
That's what I want to know. Is it colors? Like, what is a child who's never lived outside the womb dreaming about? Does he hear from the sounds he's hearing from his mom? Like, what is he? I don't know.
Yeah, it's likely a lot of sounds, a lot of smells. So the things that the fetus can do really well are smell and taste the amniotic fluid. An interesting study showed that in moms who ate a lot of carrots or drank a lot of carrot juice, their babies would then prefer oats made with carrot juice when they started solid foods. So the fetus is swallowing a lot of amniotic fluid and getting that taste in its mouth, and it will also be able to recognize his mother when he comes out just by smelling her breast milk. So if he doesn't get to see, hear, or like anything, he'll just sniff her breast milk and be like, that one's my mom, and that's the one he'll prefer. So it's pretty cool how the experience in the womb can really help. In terms of dreaming, I bet he's not dreaming in color because actually most newborns come out colorblind. They can only really distinguish reds and oranges from white. And the rest of the colors sort of come online by about 4 months. So
that's so cool. Yeah, no, I was thinking about the dream because I was like, what are the fetus? What's the little baby fetus dreaming about? Because they're obviously not dreaming about the TV show they just watched on Netflix. But
nope.
So that is really neat. So the child can smell his mother's breast milk and know it's his mom. What other cool things are you leaving out about this development of this child? Because you got all kinds of facts. I didn't even know. I'm a mom of 4, and I had no idea they could taste amniotic fluid.
Oh yeah, and another fun one is that they can recognize music and stories that they've heard in the womb. So basically, you give an infant a little pacifier, and they can suck on things on the pacifier to hear them more or less. And so basically, the infant will be able to recognize a story that it's already heard, and it will like suck in a like soothing pattern versus like a story it hasn't heard before. It will suck in an interested pattern.
Wow.
So even So even stories that you read to your pregnant belly, like that will influence the newborn when he comes out. And that happens pretty early. So even at the end of the second trimester, if the longest gap I ever saw was basically 10 weeks between the reading of a story or the playing of a song. And then the fetus remembered that all the way until it came out at 39 or 40 weeks. So, yeah. So basically, they have a much better memory than we give them credit for.
That's crazy. So there's research going on just that are trying to measure the memory capacity of a fetus.
Yep.
That's so cool. That's so neat. So what do you say? I guess I want to get to some of the harder questions because I've got you here and you're such a great resource. We hear, a lot about the notion of suffering, right? Of abortion, I don't like abortion, but I don't think a child should be born who's going to be born to a lifetime of pain, whether it's emotional pain or physical pain. And sometimes I'll hear the argument, about children who have anencephaly, of children who, they don't. I was actually, sad story, I was at a Catholic university's fundraising banquet, and a man came up to me and I was talking to he and his wife, and they were telling me how pro-life they were. And then he started telling me how he was some sort of physician, but a lot of these babies, they're just better off dead. Because, and I was like, oh, and this is an 89-year-old man. So I was like, I don't know if I want to argue with him. Like, he and his wife aren't going to get pregnant. Maybe I'll just let him just keep saying his misinformed stuff. But it was interesting to me because this is somebody who Catholic, very committed to his faith, giving a lot of money to a major Catholic university, said he was pro-life, proudly pro-life. He was talking about he was a Trump supporter and all this other stuff. But then it was like, oh yeah, but some of these babies, they're not real persons, like, because they're missing half their brain, Kristen. So of course they should be, aborted. So how do you answer that from like a scientific perspective about, these children who are born with half a brain, and some of them live multiple years?
Right. This actually calls to mind too. I have a good friend who has argued with me for a long time that God allowed genocide. And so, therefore, like, this is morally ambiguous. And I'm like, this is not morally ambiguous at all. God's justice is key and reigns. Like, even if he allowed genocide, like, he doesn't condone genocide, and we should not allow it to happen. And so I thought that's where you were going. But in terms of anencephaly, I think it's really important to remember that God is sovereign, and that we are not the ones called to play God over the lifespan. So if there's like a prenatal diagnosis of something like anencephaly, I think perinatal hospice is really the best option in that case. It allows the parents to fully grieve. It allows them to meet their children. And it allows the children to live the fullest and most complete life that God intends for them. So that's the way I would go. Again, I guess that's more of a Christian argument than a scientific argument. But in the end, like, the science doesn't necessarily give dignity to life. God does. And so we can argue all day about how they're a unique human individual. But if somebody is morally okay with killing unique human individuals, that's where we're going to end up with the sticking point.
That's right. And even if only half of your brain develops, it doesn't make you less of a human. You still are a human being. You have, maybe half of the size of a brain as another human being, but you're still a member of our species. And I think that's, for me, that's a big sticking point of, if I lose my arm in an accident, I'm an amputee and I only have one arm. Yes, I might have lost a part of my body, but that doesn't mean that the rest of me is now no longer human, that doesn't change who I fundamentally am and what I was created for. So, all right. So what about the question, we talked about kind of the development of the embryo, the fertilized egg, the zygote in utero, but what about in the IVF clinic? So there was a pro-abortion person on Twitter put up this argument. It was like his way of kind of attacking all pro-lifers. He was like, ask any anti-choice person this question, that there's a clinic with like 1 million frozen embryos, and there's a 2-year-old toddler, who would you save? And if the pro-lifer says they'd save the 2-year-old toddler, not the 1 million embryos, that shows that they're hypocrites and they really don't believe embryos are human beings. And Equal Rights Institute, Josh Brahm, they did a great kind of analysis of, well, no, you might be choosing because maybe that 2-year-old is your child. So you have a relationship with the child, or you knew that child would feel pain, and where the embryos aren't going to feel pain, or there's different kind of arguments that you can make. There's also the argument of, how can you say you can't save the embryos and also save the child? Why can't you grab handfuls of embryos and put in your pocket as you're running out with the child? So but they used it as like this kind of like, oh, gotcha moment. So what do you say to somebody who like would present that burning IVF clinic kind of thought experiment to you of, well, look, these millions of embryos, they're not human beings. They're frozen, potential human beings. How would you answer that?
Yeah, so this is a very tricky question. But I think it's important to remember that a zygote inside the female reproductive system will become a newborn and an adult unless the process is purposefully stopped with an abortion. A zygote outside the female reproductive system is still a unique human individual, but it cannot mature unless a human intervenes and puts it inside a female reproductive system. So I think that the zygote still in the freezer still has value, and I think it's really awesome when people adopt these snowflake babies. And basically bring them to term. But the key difference between an embryo in the womb and a zygote created by in vitro fertilization is that the embryo in the womb is just on that trajectory unless something stops it. So practically speaking, stopping the process with an abortion is different from never letting it start. And that's how I respond. They can still say, well, like that means you don't care as much about the frozen embryos. But I think by pointing out the process to them, you're trying to get me with a gotcha question, but I'm not suggesting that we, discard all those embryos. I'm not suggesting that we start them growing and then stop them all. I'm suggesting that if you never let the process start, that's different, just a completely different entity from stopping something in process by aborting it.
Yeah, I mean, how do you respond to some of these scientists who will say, I'm a scientist? I had someone at a Catholic college at Villanova this past school year kind of tried to tell me, well, she's a biology major, and so she knew more about science than me, and it's not a human being, it's just a potential human being. I mean, is there for me it was very clear. It was like sperm and egg unite, they create a unique DNA code. Right. Is there a more intelligent way for me to speak to these people? Because I don't know, I just kind of get exasperated. I'm like, I don't know what else to tell you. This is basic biology, and I think you want a more advanced answer, but I'm just telling you what science shows us.
Yeah, I mean, you're correct. You are telling them what science shows them. And I mean, I think it's also sometimes fun to tell them things like, to a mom and a dad, let's say they were having kids, how many times would they have to have kids until they got 2 that were exactly the same? And even if there was no swapping of any genetic information, they would need 7 trillion kids on average to get 2 kids that were exactly the same. Now, in reality, the chromosomes swap a lot of genetic information with one another as they divide into the sperm and the egg. So the probability is even lower than that. And in fact, people have more than one scientist has claimed that there's enough genetic variation that no two humans ever have been or ever will be genetically identical. So that's a fun thing to hang your hat on. Like, hey, if you just think about how you sort 23 chromosomes out and combine them back together, 1 in 7 trillion is a lot for just the basics of sorting chromosomes. And so, you have the correct understanding. They're not a potential human being. They are a human being, and they are just in the process of growing. So,
yeah, they're a human being with potential. I think it's what you said though at the beginning was very interesting. Of there's science, but science doesn't tell us how to treat those human beings with dignity. That's something else that teaches us that. And I think that's when we see we hear people, I'm a biology major, I'm a scientist, but then they advocate for abortion. It's because they understand what the science is, but they are, creating they have a different worldview or a different version of what human beings deserve personhood or person rights. They've kind of separated the human being from the human person. Have you heard that argument of I've had students before who will say, oh, okay, fine, it's a human being, but it's not a human person. And then I asked what you suggest at the beginning. Well, at what point does somebody become a human person? And it's always a varying shade of personhood, depending on whatever they ask.
Yeah, I like to remind people that the burden of proof is on us. If we can't prove there's no human inside the human being, then we need to protect that human, right? It's the same with pain. I get this in the pain argument a lot. So people will say, we don't know if the fetus is in pain. Well, the burden of proof is on us. If we can't prove the fetus is not in pain, then we have to treat it as if it's in pain, because we do this in every other scientific domain. In anesthesiology, you don't say, I don't think that this comatose patient is not in pain, so we don't need to anesthetize them to do this. Animal welfare, we would never say, I don't think this injured animal is not in pain, or even postnatal care. So as soon as they're out of the womb, we take care of them as if they're in pain, even though they can't point to a pain scale and say, this is a level 8. I'm really in pain.
What does science tell us about the child feeling pain? I know there was a study that came out in January of this year, and there was a pro-choice and a pro-life scientist, and they were suggesting that it might even be as early as I think it was 12 and a half weeks or close to 13, towards the end of the 12th week.
Yeah, so that was a really awesome paper, because Derbyshire has always been on the liberal end of saying, the fetus can't feel pain, and he really changed his mind, which was very interesting to see. So pain is an interesting topic because if you just look it up in the scientific dictionary, it involves this cognitive and emotional component. Now, scientists have a technical term that is called nociception. And nociception is basically when you get a pain receptor that responds to something in its environment. So nociception is easy to measure. Is the pain receptor active or is it not? Pain is a lot harder to measure. You're supposed to say, it's about an 8 on the scale of 1 to 10. So what do we know about nociception, since this one is the one we can measure? Well, we know that these nociceptors start to cover the fetus's mouth area and the fingertips by 7 weeks. And we also know that the fetus will reflexively move away from a painful stimuli by 7.5 weeks after conception. So in terms of the burden of proof being on us, I would say that's the point when we need to say, yeah, the fetus is moving away from pain. We need to assume that it's feeling something in terms of pain in order to be moving away from that. We also know that the fetus has a stress response to painful stimuli. So if basically a doctor needs to insert a needle to do a blood draw, the fetus will react with vigorous body and breathing movements in the ultrasound, and it will release a bunch of stress hormones. And if you can say this process that stresses the fetus is not causing it pain, I think that's a really weak argument. Obviously, if something's stressing you, it's I feel like it would be causing you pain. So in terms of the new paper, they were really arguing that there's a neural connection between those nociceptors and the higher level areas called the cortex, that basically starts forming around 12 and a half weeks and forms a lot more after 20 weeks. And so basically the pro-choice movement wanted to say that there was no pain felt until after this 20-week point, when these connections start to get observed more and more consistently. But the 12 and a half week time point is basically saying we see the start of these connections forming. And again, as science advances, we start to learn more and more about what existed, and we just couldn't see it yet. Because it's often the case that something is there and we just can't measure it yet. And so I think 12 and a half weeks is way more conservative. I even move it all the way back to 7.5 weeks, where the fetus is moving away from a painful stimuli. But I think an argument could be made for the 7.5 weeks or the 12.5 weeks. So
what's the other, I guess, to wrap up the kind of podcast, I'm glad we ended on this, because this is a subject that fetal pain we're going to be hearing a lot about. There's, hopefully there'll be a Supreme Court decision on some of the fetal pain laws soon. But what's the argument that the other side makes when it comes to fetal pain? Is it just that you're lying and that's not what science tells us? Or is it we just don't care? Like, what? I have a hard time believing, like, what is their winning argument there?
So their winning argument, or what they're trying to say.
Or they're trying to win, I guess.
Yeah, right. Is basically that in order to feel pain and not just nociception, you really need these cognitive elements and this emotional element, and that you can't have that emotional element until you get this relay in the thalamus that moves out to the cortex. And so even if they want to hang their hat on that, again, this is what that 12.5 weeks paper was saying, is that we think there's already a connection at 12.5 weeks that would be functional to do this. But they would say, oh no, we can't really see it. We can't see it a lot of the time until it's at least 20 weeks. And so that's the crux of their argument. So what's cool is I think their argument will crumble as we learn more and more about how exactly those connections are forming and observe them and see them there. Because again, almost always things are there before you can finally measure them. In fetal development.
And I think we'll see their argument continue to crumble as, the ultrasound, that window to the womb was kind of their first big crumbling block when everyone was using ultrasound, and then now it was 3D and 4D ultrasound. They're going to continue having to refine and change their talking points. It's interesting too, because you think, well, why wouldn't they just say, fine, we're going to anesthetize the fetus? Well, they can do that, but it's going to cost more money for the abortion, which, they want to provide the cheapest abortion they can. And two, if they have to tell a woman they had to anesthetize their child, might make her change her mind about choosing the abortion. So it humanitizes the preborn child, which is something they never want to have happen. It's why they want to use fertilized egg and try to use fertilized egg even when the child's 9 months in utero, right? So thank you so much, Dr. Furth, for coming on today. I really appreciate your time and kind of sharing some of these tidbits with me. I took some good notes. How can folks stay in touch with you?
Well, they can certainly email me. My email is katrina.furth@gmail.com. And they can also write to the Charlotte Lozier Institute, and all of that will get forwarded my way.
Yeah, you should definitely check out the Charlotte Lozier Institute. Katrina and her colleagues there publish papers, and they're expert witnesses for a lot of states and federal, committees when they're talking about abortion legislation. So make sure you follow their work there. So thanks so much, Katrina, for coming on. I really appreciate your help and your scientific perspective. And thank you all for tuning in today on Explicitly Pro-Life. Make sure you subscribe and share this episode with your friends, even your pro-choice friends and family members. Talk to you all next week. Bye, guys.